This panel is on the lessons of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, and we're going to speak just a little bit about the DACA program as well. Our format, or at least I will be the more traditional kind of short presentations, no more than 12 minutes each by our distinguished panel. They are Muzaffar Chishti of the Migration Policy Institute's New York University office, Jan Ting, who's a professor of law at Temple University and a former assistant INS commissioner with the George H.W. Bush administration, and Charles Kamasaki of the National Council of La Raza. The panelists will be able to kind of respond to each other afterwards, and I may ask a question, but we're going to try to, as past panels have, reserve significant time for exchange with you all. If Senator McCain comes early, Lisa or Doris or both are going to give us the high sign, or maybe flat out give us the hook, and we're going to end quickly. Let me start with a couple of, just a reflection on DACA. It's something that I actually blogged about yesterday. And a fact that we've learned about it, which I think is an absolutely remarkable fact, which is that service providers are telling us that those that have carefully screened DACA, potentially DACA eligible people, have found that in some cases up to 25% of them were actually eligible for legal status through some other means. And that's a pretty remarkable fact. And you combine that with the fact that under the New Immigrant Survey, which, as you know, is a longitudinal study of lawful permanent residents and their children, which just found that in 2003, of the people that became lawful permanent residents, 38%, a little bit more than 38% of them were at one point unauthorized immigrants. And then a third fact, which is that, as we know, at latest count, 4.4 million people, 97% of whom have a qualifying family relationship to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. In other words, they've been tentatively or past the first stage of the visa petition process, have been approved and languish in visa backlogs, 4.4 million, and of course most of them in the United States. So think about that when we're thinking about the 11 million. A substantial percentage, if this is true about the DACA applicants, might be eligible to regularize their status but don't know it. A similar percentage are the beneficiaries of approved visa petitions, and an even higher percentage of new lawful permanent residents were previously out of status. I mean, obviously those findings go to the fluidity of immigration status, and I don't think that that phenomenon actually gets enough attention in the immigration debate. The facts also suggest that the issue of widespread illegality, if you want to call it that in the immigration system, it's not just a rule of law or a public policy issue or a matter of aligning legal immigration with labor needs or family needs. It's also an access to justice issue. And I think that's worth mentioning in a law and policy conference. If we had more and better legal services for low-income immigrants, we'd have far fewer people out of status. So let me go back quickly to by way of introduction to the lessons of IRCA. And what kind of lessons are we going to talk about? Because we've seen a lot of papers at this point, the lessons of IRCA. Well, they might be political lessons. You know, how did that bill ever pass? You know, it's hard to imagine at this point because it's been so vilified since then. What were the trade-offs? What were the dynamics in Congress and between Congress and the administration? There's also potential public policy lessons. What were the different stakeholders trying to achieve through this legislation? Were its policy goals ever achievable? Were they achieved? Senator Alan Simpson, who was, of course, one of the architects of IRCA, badly wanted a fraud-resistant ID as a complement to the employer sanctions regime, and he didn't prevail in that, of course. And nonetheless, he still argues that legalizing nearly 3 million was no small accomplishment, and that it was a positive step and better than doing nothing. So He's talking about incremental reform of legalization first, and then border enforcement some years later, which I know wouldn't be very popular, and a lot of people would disagree with that right now. So in what ways was the bill's public policy, was it a public policy success, and in what ways was it a failure? And then there are this whole set of implementation questions. How was the program designed? Was it successfully implemented? What practices worked and didn't? We really have a superb panel to discuss these issues. We have Moose and Charles, who were IRCA veterans from the NGO world, and we have Professor Ting, who you could say lived with the aftermath of IRCA in the Bush 1 administration. Moose will begin by speaking mostly about the design and the implementation of the program. Professor Ting, I think, it won't come as a surprise, will speak on some of the problems and failures of IRCA. And Charles will mostly focus on the politics of it. Why and how did IRCA pass in 1996? What kind of lessons does it teach us today? But let me kick off this discussion by quoting a prominent player at the time, and that is President Ronald Reagan. And we forget this about Reagan, but in his farewell address in 1989 to the country, he talked about his famous vision, that phrase, the John Winthrop phrase of the shining city on the hill. And he described what he meant by it. And he said he saw it as a place teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's an interesting perspective. In his signing statement, Reagan hailed IRCA as a major step toward meeting the challenge to U.S. sovereignty presented by illegal migration. He said that the law satisfied the request for, quote, comprehensive immigration reform because it included employer sanctions, other types of enforcement, meaning mostly border enforcement, and the legalization program. So he used that word, that comprehensive word, to describe IRCA, but he didn't mean kind of reform of the underlying system of legal immigration. He called IRCA both generous to the alien and fair to the countless thousands of people throughout the world who seek legally to come to America. That's very much different from much of what we hear today, when legalization is often set against and viewed at odds with fair treatment of people that have played by the rules. And Reagan said that the legalization program would improve the lives of a class of individuals who now must hide in the shadows without access to many of the benefits of a free and open society. So that mattered to him by all accounts, the unauthorized. On the political side, he called immigration reform one of the longest and most difficult legislative undertakings of recent memory. That's a statement that certainly resonates today. IRCA took many years to pass, and he lauded it as a bipartisan effort involving the administration and allies in Congress of both parties. That's a statement that resonates today in the way that a painful loss resonates, in a different kind of way. And finally, he said that future generations of Americans would be thankful for our efforts to humanely gain control of our borders and thereby preserve the value of one of the most sacred possessions of our people, American citizenship. And we'll hear about that control and humane control of the border in our next panel. So Moose, that's kind of the beginning of the story. And why don't you take on the task of telling us how it ended?
Okay. Thank you, folks, and coming back to this panel. I've been on many panels, but never between lunch and Senator McCain. But someone got to do it. So, I think most of you realize that Immigration Reform and Control Act, which for the rest of this panel I'll shorten to call IRCA, just because my time is being marked, was clearly a milestone in U.S. immigration history. It was clearly the first time that Congress actually, in a very concerted way, attempted to deal with unauthorized immigration. But those of you who are frustrated about the progress of the present era should remember how frustrating that experience was. It took about 5 years for a Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, which formed the blueprint for the Immigration Reform and Control Act, to even come up with a report. It started with President Carter's election. The report was not delivered till after President Reagan got elected. It was also, it came on the heels of other administrative initiatives that have been happening in the Ford administration, in the Carter administration, and in the Reagan administration. The Senate passed, again, those of you who are watching the present era, the Senate passed the IRCA 3 times, in 82, in 83, and in 85, and it did not become law. The House passed the bill in 84 and 86, it did not become a law. It was only in the final days, in the waning days of the 99th Congress, that Congress actually passed Immigration Reform and Control Act. So almost when everyone had declared it dead. Lawrence Fuchs, who was the executive director of the Select Commission on Immigration, wrote his brilliant article called The Cops That Just Would Not Die. That is the hallmark and the background of the Immigration Reform and Control Act. IRCA, at the end of the day, was a 3-legged stool. It's a famous proverb that Senator Simpson himself coined. It was 3 legs of the stool were border enforcement, interior enforcement of the workplace, and a legalization program. We are 27 years out of IRCA, and we know that the unauthorized population today is 3 times than it was at the times of IRCA. About 7 million unauthorized workers are working in the workplace. So obviously something about it which was promised did not work. And it's good to sort of unwrap some of the mystery about why we are today where we are. First of all, the obvious thing, like all legislations, it was written with incomplete knowledge. It was written with political compromises, and then there were huge challenges of implementation, which in my mind sort of finally diluted the very effect of the law that was supposed to have prevented. But let me first talk about border enforcement, get it out of the way. Border enforcement was an important, obviously, the pillar, one of the legs of the stool. The Immigration Service obviously increased staffing of the Border Patrol soon after IRCA, but it did not get anywhere near the resources that it needed for border enforcement till the mid-90s, as you heard from Congressman Morrison today. In fact, it did not get the kind of resources it needed till after 9/11 happened. But the fact is that after 9/11, we have developed a huge, formidable machinery, as we call it, of enforcement, in which border control now is key. Just for reference about lessons of IRCA, in 1986, we spent $1 billion on immigration enforcement. And last year, we spent $18 billion. That's about 850% increase in immigration enforcement. And obviously, it has had an effect. As we know, that in the last few years, beginning with the recession, the unauthorized immigration flow has essentially come to net zero. And it hasn't really changed since then. Obviously, the recession and the factors and changes in Mexico that have played a huge role, in some of you heard this morning. But border enforcement of the level that we have done is another important part of that story. But even if we do our border enforcement completely well, it will never stop illegal immigration because, as you heard this morning, 40 to 50% of that is overstays who do not cross the border. So, as Congress said, that brings us to the second leg of the IRCA stool, the employment verification. IRCA, again, was the first attempt by Congress, first federal law, which made it illegal for employers to hire unauthorized workers.